It was on a Wednesday afternoon nearly 30 years ago, on April 29, 1992. I was a lawyer working in a law office in Midtown Los Angeles. That day, a jury returned a verdict of not guilty for 3 out of 4 Los Angeles police officers charged with assault and excessive use of force in beating a black man named Rodney King. The jury could not reach a decision regarding the 4th officer. Within a short time after the verdict was broadcast on the news, the riots in the streets of Los Angeles began. I hurried home and stayed there watching the events unfold on television. On Friday, May 1st, Rodney King himself appeared for a press conference at the offices of his attorney. The statement he made to the press that day, I will remember for the rest of my life. As the violence around the city raged, Rodney King said, "People, I just want to say, can we all get along?" It's almost 30 years later now, and yet here we are again, still. Has anything changed? Most of you no doubt are aware of the backstory of the Rodney King riots. It began more than a year earlier on March 3rd, 1991, when Rodney King tried to avoid arrest while driving his car at extremely high speeds in the Los Angeles freeways and then in residential neighborhoods. Rodney King had a criminal record. He had been convicted of robbery and was put on parole. That night, he had been drinking with some friends, and he was driving under the influence of alcohol. He was afraid that if he was caught, the DUI charge would constitute a violation of his parole, and he would have to return to prison. When the police chase ended and Rodney King had stopped his car, there were several police cars there at the scene, as well as a helicopter. King and his friends were ordered out of the car. His 2 friends complied and were arrested without incident. Rodney King, though, acted strangely, resisted arrest, and was struck with a taser gun and then beaten 56 times by the police officers with their batons, and he was kicked 6 times before the police finally handcuffed him. The entire beating was captured on videotape by a local citizen. That video was played hundreds, if not thousands of times on television over the course of the next year. The 4 police officers directly involved in the beating were charged with assault and excessive use of force, and the trial took place in a suburb of Los Angeles with 10 white jurors, 1 Latino, and 1 Asian. When the acquittal of the police officers was publicized, blacks all across the city were stunned and appalled. Rodney King was not a model citizen. He had a criminal record. He was driving under the influence. He was driving at very dangerous speeds in the city of Los Angeles. But in the United States, we expect our police officers to act with professionalism. They're supposed to be trained in techniques and procedures when making an arrest so that excessive force is not used. At some point, though, these officers lost control of themselves. They lost control of their anger. Anyone watching that videotape could see that excessive force was used. Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley, who had himself earlier served as a police officer, said that the jury's verdict will not blind us to what we saw in that videotape. The men who beat Rodney King do not deserve to wear the uniform of the LAPD, he said. And then President George H.W. Bush said, "Viewed from outside the trial, it was hard to understand how the verdict could possibly square with the video. Those civil rights leaders with whom I met were stunned, and so was I, and so was Barbara, and so were my kids." What angered African Americans was not just the verdict that acquitted the police officers, it was also the context of the history of the treatment of African Americans in our country. Africans were brought to this country mostly against their will, bought and sold as slaves, considered the property of their white slave owners. Slaves could be beaten at will if they displeased their masters. They were not really considered full human beings. When our enlightened founding fathers wrote that all men are created equal, they really meant all white men are created equal. Black men could be bought and sold. Black men had no right to vote. Black men were not considered citizens, at least not in the southern states. And discrimination was pretty apparent in the North as well, if not quite so blatant. And it was also, unfortunately, not so long ago, only several decades, when it was not uncommon to find a black man hanging from a tree, lynched for some unknown crime, a crime he had not been formally charged with and certainly not formally been convicted of. With this tragic history in mind, when black Americans watched the beating of Rodney King, being hit and kicked in the head repeatedly while he was lying on the ground, they felt that perhaps not much had changed in 1991. Here was the black man being beaten mercilessly, and the white police officers were not held accountable. After all, he was a black man, and a criminal at that. He got what was coming to him. So here we are again today. Less than 2 weeks ago, on Monday, May 25th, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd was asphyxiated by a police officer who held his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, literally snuffing out his life on camera for all to see. And it should be noted that there were at least 2 other well-publicized recent and senseless killings of black people in the past 3 months. Now, many people have pointed out that George Floyd was no role model. Like Rodney King, he had a criminal record. In Floyd's case, following a string of arrests for theft and drug possession, Floyd was charged in 2007 for armed robbery and a home invasion. He took a plea deal in 2009, was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and was paroled in 2013 after spending 4 of those years. After his release, he became involved in Resurrection Houston, a local ministry. In 2014, he moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he took jobs driving a truck and providing security at a restaurant. And he lived in St. Louis Park. In 2017, he filmed an anti-gun violence video. And in 2020, he unfortunately lost his security job due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then on May 25th, Floyd was arrested for passing a counterfeit $20 bill at a grocery store in Minneapolis. Floyd was handcuffed face down in the street, while one officer, Derek Chauvin, had his knee on Floyd's neck, and 2 other officers further restrained Floyd, and a 4th prevented onlookers from intervening. For the last 3 of those minutes, Floyd was motionless and had no pulse, but officers made no attempt to revive him. Chauvin kept his knee on Floyd's neck as arriving emergency medical technicians attempted to treat him. At the time of his death, he was apparently under the influence of fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. And I'm getting all of these details, by the way, from Wikipedia, and I have not independently verified any of them. But it would seem that it's true that Floyd was not a role model, although it seemed perhaps like he was trying to make a new life for himself after serving his time in prison. Until the current pandemic took his job away. But whatever his past, he did not deserve to die in the streets of Minneapolis the way he did. The officer in this case, as in the case of Rodney King, lost sight of George Floyd's humanity. In other words, at least for those last precious minutes of Floyd's life, Chauvin did not see Floyd as a human being. Whether it was anger, rage, or racism, or some combination of all of them, the officer lost control. And now we have had nearly 2 weeks of demonstrations in cities all across this country. Yes, there have been violence and looting amongst some of the demonstrators, some of it caused by opportunists. Some seem to be caused by interlopers trying to make the demonstrators look bad. I know that sounds weird, but that's what's being reported. And some of it was caused by people who lost control of their anger and rage, despite the pleas of Floyd's family and demonstration organizers, and they have crossed the line of peaceful protest. But the overwhelming number of people protesting have been peaceful, and we should not confuse or disparage the overwhelming numbers with the few who are crossing the line. In Houston, on May 31st, our own police chief, Art Acevedo, marched with the demonstrators. On Tuesday, over 60,000 people gathered to demonstrate peacefully in our city. We can and should be proud of our leadership here and our community, that we have not seen some of the violence committed in other cities. A large part of that, in my opinion, has been the restraint of our police force as well as the restraint of the demonstrators. So what happens now? Has anything changed in all of our country over the past 30 years? I think so. I hope so. I think there is overwhelming support and understanding now that things do need to change. What can we do? Rabbi Strauss listed a number of specific things that we can do as individuals and as a community last night. This morning, I just want to point to a few lessons from our own tradition. First, of course, is the basic principle that according to the account in Genesis, God created the entire human race initially with one person, Adam. Or you might say one couple, Adam and Eve. And this teaches us that we are all related to each other, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity. The Midrash teaches us that only one human being, Adam, was created by God so that there should be peace among human beings. Astounding. Almost 2,000 years ago, our ancestors said, one human being was created so that there should be peace among human beings. So that one person cannot say to another, my ancestor is greater than yours. An apparent retort to racism, my ancestor is not greater than yours. We're all related. This also teaches the greatness of the Holy One. For when a human being casts many coins from one mold, they all look identical. But when the Holy One creates each human being in the image of primal Adam, they are not all identical. In other words, God has intentionally created a variety of shapes, colors, and sizes of human beings to display God's greatness. We're not different from each other in order to claim one is superior to the next, but rather to exult in our differences, for it demonstrates God's greatness and enhances our world with diversity and the potential for growth by learning from each other. Second, as the great sage Ben Azai taught, we also learn from this story of creation that we are all created in God's image. Every human being shares the spark of the divine within him or herself. And before we belittle, or God forbid, dehumanize another human being, we should look into their eyes and see that spark of God and holiness inside them. And if we can keep this principle in mind, a lot of pain and tragedy can be avoided. Third, as Jews, we have learned from a long and painful history of prejudice against us that we must always be alert to prejudice in the world. We are commanded to be kind to the stranger, the other, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Our slavery in Egypt is not understood as a license to enslave others, God forbid, but rather is seen as a lesson teaching us to treat each human being with the dignity and respect we would have wanted for ourselves while we lived in that country. The Anti-Defamation League was founded as a result of the lynching of a Jewish man named Leo Frank in Marietta, Georgia in 1913. But the ADL took its mission to be more than just a fight against anti-Semitism. The ADL also seeks to secure justice and fair treatment for everyone. Fourth, as Jews, we're also taught to question everything. Every passage of Talmud is loaded with questions. One of the crucial elements of the Passover Seder is that someone at the table needs to ask a question, and the more the merrier. We have learned that life is complicated. It is never black and white, but always nuanced in infinite shades of gray. Before we jump to conclusions about someone we see walking on the street, we need to try and understand the facts. Al tistakel bekankan el b'ma yesh bo, the Pirkei Avot teaches us. Do not look at the flask, the outside, but rather what is inside. Do not jump to conclusions about someone based on the color of his or her skin, or the clothes they're wearing, or the expression on their face, or other superficial information. Ask questions, seek knowledge, seek wisdom, seek understanding. Fifth, we must always strive to keep our anger under control. The great sage Maimonides taught us that when you lose control in your anger, you are actually committing one of the gravest sins in Judaism, idolatry, because you're letting your anger rule over you. You no longer are serving God or our Creator, but rather you are serving your anger. When we lash out thoughtlessly, someone may get hurt or worse, and we are responsible for the consequences of our own actions, even when we do so out of very human emotions like fear or anger. In this week's Torah portion, we read the priestly blessing. In it, the priest calls upon God to bless us and watch over us. This week, and perhaps for the next few months, let us pray that God watches over us to help us control our anger and to respond with love and kindness for each other instead. Next, the priest calls upon God to cause God's light to shine upon us, perhaps a metaphor for having God's wisdom and warmth enveloping us with grace and compassion. This week, and perhaps for the next few months, may we also shine our own light on each other and do so with grace and compassion. And finally, the priest calls upon God to lift God's face toward us, or in other words, to take notice of us, to pay attention to us, and to grant us the precious gift of peace. This week, and perhaps for the next few months, may we also look upon each other and really pay attention to each other, seeing the humanity and the spark of God's divine presence in everyone we meet. And by so doing, let us work to create in our world that precious gift of peace. Perhaps, if we can learn these lessons, we can answer Rodney King's famous question, can we all get along? In the affirmative. Yes, we can all get along. Shabbat Shalom.